standing at the junction of the two streams which form the main arm of the Brunswick River. I'm Frank Mills, and I was born back up in what looks like the forest behind me. It was once a dairy farm. That's where Dad selected. It was the normal practice of the boys to wander the stream when they were still going to school. There were very few tracks, so streams were a good pathway. There were so many turtles and things in the olden days. We'd look for the catfish's nests and see them. And we'd have plenty of mud gudgeons, eels, and a few mullet. Any big stream has its own big water holes, or swimming holes as we call them. This one was a real beauty. We all enjoyed it. People would gather there for picnics and swim. This waterfall is still used to this present day. It's a lovely swimming hole. I had a little over 400 acres of freehold, plus another 200 of leasehold land, stretching right across the main arm valley. It was just before the age of the hippie, and the dairy farms were on the way out. That's in the late 60s, and bananas weren't thriving either at that time. So the country was soon depleted of a lot of its population, and this left the big vacuum for the new folk of the early 70s. And in 1972, I sold out 400 acres for either $4,000 or $6,000 per 100 acre to the new folk. They were referred to as hippies, but I preferred to call them, they were just new folk who had settled here. And Main Arm was changing its identity. Skinny dipping was, yes, it happened all right, there's no doubt. Once I left Main Arm, I'd love to come back and camp out here, because when you were born and bred in the bush, you long to get back, as I do today.
We used to treat mangroves really badly in Australia and probably all over the world. We used to regard them as wastelands, mozzie-infested wastelands. We now have learnt a lot more about them and no longer treat them like that. I'm Simon Freeden and I'm an environmental scientist. I'm also a kayak guide and a surf coach. The Brunswick River is very wet. The tides have a major impact on it. Rainfall coming in also has a major impact. It's a very dynamic system that's always changing. And that's why the fishermen very seldom will go to the same place day after day after day to fish, because the conditions are different and the fish have either moved upriver or downriver. And if you're a fisherman, well, you've got to think like a fish. Two main mangroves that we see on the Brunswick River are the grey mangrove, which is your tall, big one, and we often see the small river mangrove too. The roots of mangroves are called eumetophores, and that's the fancy scientific name for eumetophores, are breathing roots. So the breathing roots do a really good job of filtering out that salt water. What the plant takes up is basically fresh water, a little bit of salt in it, puts that little bit of salt in its old leaves and drops those leaves. And those leaves are eaten by crabs, prawns, fish, all of that. And they're actually the start of the food chain. It's actually turning sunlight into fish food, if you like. And mangroves actually create land. What they do is all their fine network of roots, and when we get a flood, a lot of the river silt gets trapped all around those roots, and so therefore they stabilise the riverbanks, and a lot of mangroves actually create land. They're very, very scenically beautiful, and we're so fortunate that it's got a lot of its vegetation intact on the riverbanks, and lots of history there and lots of environment. It's great.
My memories of Granny Hannah, because she was very strict, and it's probably, back to when she was a child. They would have had to be fairly strict to bring that into our lives. You had to do as you were told, and if you didn't, she would be very cross. A certain standard of behaviour, like a lot of people from that time. She was born on Bribie Island Mission in 1879. You were supposed to ask permission to talk about these things. However, a lot of our elders have died, and so we are just trying to find out what we can and find out some more. But this is stories that we've been told. I'm not saying everything's absolutely correct.
It was a hut made out of timber from old shipwrecks, which was washed on the shores. Hannah Hill was a sand dune. It was a sand dune prior to 1930s, where they started sand mining. That she lived there prior to 1920s with my grandfather and his siblings.
They would wrap themselves up in vines that were from the trees, and that would keep them afloat to go across the river. And it would also protect them from sharks or other predators.
From what I was told was she went down a horse and buggy, and my grandfather and his brothers were hanging on it while she was flogging that horse, and she'd go down there and get eugeries, oysters, fish, whatever was going that day, a mullet, and she would come back in the afternoon and sell to farmers in exchange for fruit and veggies, and probably meat as well, chicken and stuff like that. So yeah.
Grandmother Hannah was a midwife for the Aboriginal community, so which ties in with what my dad used to say, she's always running off doing something. So I assume that's right. We never knew all those years. You think about it, in the middle of the night, she just drove off in her buggy, or she probably did it on foot. And I'd love to find out how many other people were born that she brought into this world.
To me, she comes across as a very strong-willed woman, and I think I take a bit like her.
I do believe that a lot of us carry a lot of her traits.
Just was always aware of what she was doing, I think, at all times, and what she had to do to get by. I think that's a woman of resilience.